There's a lesson hidden inside that first moment of stillness, and most people miss it because they're too focused on what they lost to notice what they gained. When you stop reaching, when the noise quiets and the urge to explain dissolves, you begin to see the shape of things as they truly are, not as you hoped they'd be, not as you imagined they could become, but as they have always been beneath your effort. This is the first Stoic lesson, though it rarely announces itself. That clarity does not arrive through confrontation, it arrives through restraint. The Stoics believed that the world reveals itself most honestly when we stop interfering with it. When you remove your emotional labor from a situation, you don't destroy the connection, you expose it. You see who steps forward when you step back. You see what remains when your effort is no longer holding everything together. Marcus Aurelius warned against exhausting the soul by trying to manage what was never ours to control. And yet, how often do we do exactly that? We manage conversations, emotions, expectations. We soften discomfort for others. We translate our needs into something more palatable. We convince ourselves that patience will eventually be rewarded, that presence will be reciprocated, that consistency will inspire care. Until one day, it doesn't. And that is when the discipline begins. Because discipline is not forcing yourself to endure imbalance. Discipline is knowing when to withdraw your energy without resentment. When you go quiet, not as a tactic, but as a truth, the world responds differently. People respond differently. Not always with understanding, but with awareness. And awareness is uncomfortable. Awareness forces people to confront what they were benefiting from without acknowledging. This is why stillness feels powerful. Not because it manipulates, but because it removes illusion. The Stoics never confused silence with weakness. They understood that the loudest forces in nature are often invisible. Gravity does not shout. Time does not argue. Decay does not plead. And yet, nothing escapes their influence. Your stillness works the same way. When you stop explaining yourself, you remove the scaffolding others used to avoid responsibility. When you stop filling gaps, those gaps become impossible to ignore. When you stop compensating for indifference, indifference finally has to stand on its own. Epictetus taught that we are disturbed not by events, but by our judgments about them. And one of the most damaging judgments we make is believing that our worth must be proven through endurance. That if we just tolerate a little more, explain a little better, give a little longer, we will finally be met with the recognition we crave. But recognition earned through self-erasure is not recognition at all. It is dependency disguised as connection. This leads to the second Stoic lesson, one that reshapes how you understand effort. Effort is not noble when it is one-sided. Effort is not virtuous when it costs you your peace. The Stoics never glorified suffering for its own sake. They believed in choosing difficulty when it served virtue, not when it served someone else's comfort. And there is nothing virtuous about abandoning yourself to maintain access to someone who does not meet you with equal presence. When you chase, you create a hierarchy that never needed to exist. You place someone above you not because they asked, but because you surrendered the ground beneath your feet. You begin to orbit their moods, their availability, their silence. And slowly, without noticing, your internal stability becomes dependent on external response. This is why chasing feels anxious, why waiting for replies feels heavy, why silence from the other side feels like judgment. You are no longer standing in your own frame. And frames matter more than people realize. Every interaction carries an invisible structure that determines who leans forward and who leans back, who seeks and who selects, who explains and who listens. When you overextend, you step out of your frame and into theirs. You make their approval the center of gravity, and once that happens, everything tilts. The Stoics warned against this loss of internal authority. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that no one could harm his soul without his consent. But consent is subtle. It happens not in dramatic moments, but in quiet compromises, in the messages you answer too quickly, In the boundaries, you soften to avoid discomfort. In the silence, you rush to fill because you're afraid of what it might mean. Until one day, you don't rush anymore. And that is the third lesson. Not every silence is a problem to solve. Some silences are invitations. Some are revelations. Some are warnings. When you stop reacting to silence with anxiety, you reclaim your power. You allow space to exist without immediately interpreting it as rejection. You let unanswered messages remain unanswered. You let pauses stretch without apologizing for them. And in doing so, you shift from reaction to observation. Observation is a Stoic virtue. To observe without judgment. To notice without attaching identity to outcome. To see clearly without rushing to control. This is where discernment begins. Discernment is not suspicion. It is not withdrawal born of fear. It is the calm evaluation of reality without fantasy layered on top. It is recognizing patterns without trying to excuse them. It is understanding that consistency is not chemistry, and intensity is not intimacy. When you slow down enough to see clearly, you realize how often you mistook availability for connection, how often you mistook being needed for being valued, how often you stayed because leaving felt cruel, even when staying required cruelty towards yourself. Seneca warned that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, but there is another kind of suffering he also cautioned against, the suffering that comes from delaying necessary action, from waiting for clarity that has already been offered, just not in the form we wanted. Silence is clarity. Distance is information. Inconsistency is an answer. And once you accept that, the fourth lesson unfolds naturally. You do not need closure from others to move forward. The need for closure often masks a deeper desire, to be reassured that our effort mattered, to hear that we were seen, to be told that our presence made a difference. And when that confirmation never comes, the mind loops, searching for meaning in fragments. The Stoics understood the danger of this. They taught that peace comes not from resolution, but from acceptance, from understanding that not every story ends with explanation, and not every departure is an indictment of your worth. Sometimes people leave because honesty would require them to change. Sometimes silence is chosen because accountability feels heavier than loss. That is not your burden to carry. When you stop seeking answers from those unwilling to give them, you free your mind from endless reconstruction. You stop rewriting conversations. You stop analyzing tone. You stop imagining alternate endings. And slowly, the energy that once chased understanding begins to return home. This is where detachment becomes healing. Not the detachment of indifference, but the detachment of clarity. Detachment does not erase feeling, it refines it. It removes urgency. It removes the compulsion to fix what was never yours to repair. It allows you to care without clinging, to remember without reopening wounds, to move forward without dragging the past behind you. And here, the fifth Stoic lesson takes root. Peace is not found in being chosen. It is found in choosing yourself. Choosing yourself does not mean isolation. It means alignment. It means your actions no longer contradict your values. It means you no longer trade self-respect for proximity. It means you no longer negotiate your boundaries in moments of emotional hunger. The Stoics believed that freedom was internal, that the only true captivity was dependence on things outside our control. And nothing binds the mind faster than the need to be validated by someone who withholds it. When you release that need, your posture changes, your energy steadies, you speak less, but your words carry weight. You listen more, but you are no longer trying to decode every signal. You engage when it feels mutual, and you step back when it doesn't, without drama, without explanation. That quiet confidence is not learned through affirmation. It is learned through restraint. And restraint is the foundation of all Stoic strength.
The sixth lesson arrives quietly, almost unnoticed, because it does not announce itself with relief or triumph. It arrives as neutrality, as the absence of urgency, as the moment you realize that your emotional state no longer rises and falls in response to someone else's behavior. This is not numbness. It is independence. The Stoics spoke often of inner citadels, places within the self that remain untouched by external chaos. Marcus Aurelius returned to this image again and again, reminding himself that no matter what unfolded around him, there was always a place he could retreat to where reason governed emotion. Most people misunderstand this as emotional withdrawal, but it is something far more demanding. It is emotional sovereignty. To reach this state, you must stop outsourcing your stability. You must stop allowing another person's attention, affection, or absence to dictate your internal weather. And this is difficult because attachment disguises itself as meaning. It convinces you that intensity equals importance, that longing equals depth, that discomfort is proof you care. But the Stoics were precise thinkers. They separated feeling from truth. They understood that desire can distort perception, that longing can exaggerate significance, that the mind, when left unchecked, will turn uncertainty into obsession. Freedom begins when you stop feeding that loop. When you no longer rush to interpret a delay, when you no longer personalize distance, when you no longer imagine intent where there is only inconsistency. This is the discipline of perception. Seeing what is there, not what you hope it means. And once perception is clear, the seventh lesson becomes unavoidable. You cannot build mutuality with someone who benefits from imbalance. This realization stings, not because it is cruel, but because it is honest. Many relationships persist not because they are reciprocal, but because one person compensates for the absence of the other. One initiates, one explains. One adjusts, one waits. And over time, this imbalance becomes familiar enough to feel normal. But normal is not healthy, and familiar is not fair. The Stoics believed justice was not limited to courts and laws. Justice applied to daily conduct, to how energy was exchanged, to how effort was returned. To tolerate chronic imbalance was, in their view, a quiet injustice against oneself. When you stop compensating, something important happens. The dynamic is forced to reveal its true nature. Either the other person steps forward, meeting the space you've left behind, or the connection collapses under the weight of its own asymmetry. Both outcomes are information, and information is not an enemy. It is a guide. This is why the Stoics valued truth over comfort. Comfort can be manufactured, truth cannot. And once you see the truth of a dynamic, you are no longer obligated to maintain illusions for the sake of peace. Peace built on denial is fragile. It shatters the moment reality intrudes. The eighth lesson follows naturally. Disappointment is not a failure of judgment. It is often the result of ignoring what you already knew. We like to believe disappointment comes from being misled, but more often it comes from overriding our own perception, from noticing patterns and choosing to reinterpret them, from sensing misalignment and telling ourselves to be patient, from feeling undervalued and convincing ourselves that endurance is love. The Stoics warned against this kind of self-betrayal. Epictetus taught wisdom begins when we stop lying to ourselves about what we are willing to accept, not what we hope will change, not what we believe someone could become, but what is actually happening consistently without justification. When you honor that truth, disappointment loses its sting. It still hurts, but it no longer confuses. It no longer destabilizes. It becomes a clean emotion, brief, informative, and finite. You feel it, you learn from it, and you move forward. This is emotional maturity, not emotional hardness. Hardness numbs, maturity integrates. And from this integration, the ninth lesson emerges. You do not need to be understood by everyone. You need to be aligned with yourself. The desire to be understood is deeply human. It is tied to survival, to belonging, to being seen. But when this desire turns into a requirement, it becomes a trap. You begin explaining instead of living, justifying instead of choosing, softening your truth so it lands more comfortably in someone else's expectations. The Stoics rejected this impulse. They believed virtue was sufficient justification, that if your actions were aligned with reason and integrity, approval was optional. Temporary misunderstanding was a small price to pay for long-term self-respect. This does not mean becoming rigid or unkind. It means becoming anchored. It means your sense of self no longer depends on agreement. You allow others their interpretations without internalizing them. You release the need to correct every misconception. You trust that consistency over time speaks louder than explanation ever could. Silence, once again, becomes strength. And with this strength, the 10th lesson takes form. Letting go is not an act of loss. It is an act of accuracy. We frame letting go as surrender, as defeat, as giving up something valuable. But the Stoics framed it differently. To them, letting go was simply aligning desire with reality, releasing what no longer belonged to you, returning borrowed energy to its rightful owner. Holding on to what resists you drains life force. It occupies mental space. It narrows perception. Letting go does the opposite. It widens your field of awareness. It restores attention to the present. It restores momentum. This is why letting go often brings relief before it brings sadness. Relief that the internal debate has ended. Relief that the waiting is over. Relief that you no longer have to convince yourself. Sadness may follow, but it is honest sadness. It is grief without confusion. And grief, when clean, moves through the body rather than settling into it. The Stoics understood grief as a natural response, not an enemy. They allowed its place, but not its rule. They did not resist emotion, but they refused to be governed by it. Which leads to the 11th lesson. Strength is not emotional suppression. It is emotional governance. To govern emotion is to acknowledge it without surrendering authority, to feel without spiraling, to grieve without collapsing, to care without clinging. This balance is subtle and difficult, and it is why Stoicism was never meant to be easy. It demands awareness in moments where reaction feels easier. It demands restraint when expression feels justified. It demands patience when closure feels urgent. But in return, it offers something rare: stability. Not the brittle stability of avoidance, but the grounded stability of self-trust. You know you can handle disappointment because you no longer abandon yourself in response to it. You know you can survive endings because you are no longer defining yourself by what ends. And finally, the 12th lesson settles in not as instruction, but as quiet understanding. You were never meant to chase what aligns with you. What aligns with you moves towards you naturally. What values you does not require persuasion. What is meant to stay does not need to be managed. This is not fate. It is probability shaped by integrity. When you live in alignment with your values, your boundaries, your sense of worth, you reduce friction. You simplify decisions. You attract dynamics that mirror your posture rather than exploit your flexibility. The Stoics believed the good life was built not through accumulation, but through subtraction. Removing what disturbs the soul. Letting go of unnecessary desire. Choosing depth over breadth. Choosing steadiness over stimulation. And when you look back, you realize something quietly profound. The moments that felt like rejection were often redirection. The silences that hurt were often protection. The endings you feared were often open